This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can pre-order Dominaria United right now by going to cardkingdom.com/needsahone or following the link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Needsahone, and today I'm continuing with my Dominaria United limited set review. So far we've looked at every multicolored, colorless white and blue card in the set, and today we're continuing with black. Before we jump in, a few things to keep in mind. First, this is a limited review. That means I'm only talking about the viability of the cards in this video for limited formats, which are draft and sealed. That also means I'm only talking about cards that appear in draft boosters. Also, because I'm reviewing these cards ahead of time, I'm going to be wrong about some of them. That's the nature of a set review. Throughout this limited season, I'll post videos giving you updates on my thoughts of the format. Lastly, I use a letter grade system to sum up my thoughts on cards in these set reviews, and if you're unsure what those letter grades mean, you can find an explanation in the description. Alright, with all of that out of the way, let's take a look at our first black card. First, it's Aggressive Sabotage, which for 2 generic and a black is a common sorcery, and it has Kicker for 1 red mana. Kicker is a returning mechanic. It means you can pay this cost when you cast this to get an extra effect. In this case, it always makes target player discard 2 cards, but if you kicked it, you do 3 damage to that player. So this is kind of a build your own Lightning, which is pretty cool. I'm not usually a very big fan of Mind Rot effects, and that's because they occupy a really awkward place. They're sort of at their best in the early to the mid game because you're more likely to hit 2 cards, but you would also probably just like to play a creature or something on turn 3 than cast Mind Rot. Then in the late game, they're really bad top decks when both players have basically nothing in their hand. A card like Aggressive Sabotage does help shore up some of that though, since in the late game, you can still use this to get some effect, which is a lightning bolt to your opponent's face, and adding any effect, even one that's small, to a 3 mana spell that makes the opponent discard 2 is a pretty big upgrade. Mind Rot is usually a D+, and I think this one's a C. Next up, we've got Balduvian Atrocity, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/3 Phyrexian Berserker at uncommon. It has Kicker for a single red, it has Menace, and when it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, return target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. A 3 mana 2/3 with Menace is like a C, maybe a C- at worst, and you get a fair bit of value out of paying the kicker cost here. You won't always have something to get back with the effect, at least not something meaningful. But it also doesn't seem like it will be much of a challenge to get some value there often enough. The format has enough graveyard and sacrifice stuff going on that this looks pretty well positioned. If you can play this on turn 4 and get back a real body for a whole turn, it's going to be pretty sweet. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Battle Rage Blessing, which for 1 generic and a black is a common instant. It says target creature gains Death Touch and Indestructible until end of turn. This format feels like it has some of the best tricks we've seen in a while, at least on average, as this is yet another solid trick. 2 mana isn't the amount I love to pay for tricks, I would much rather pay 1, but Death Touch plus Indestructible does allow virtually any creature to win combat, and this comes with the upside of also blanking most removal. As usual, tricks are situational and risky, so even most good tricks aren't amazing, but this is one I'll definitely play the first copy of in most creature-heavy black decks. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Battlefly Swarm, which for 1 black mana is a 1/1 Phyrexian insect at common. It's got flying, and you can pay 1 black to give it Death Touch until end of turn. Most of the time, I would rather have a 1 mana 1/1 that always has Death Touch and doesn't have flying, but this is still a pretty nice 1 mana Death Toucher. Flying does undoubtedly give it some decent upside that allows it to be a reasonable attacker in the very early game, and once it can no longer be useful on that front, it can hang back and threaten to trade for anything. And yeah, one bummer about most of the 1 mana Death Touchers we see is that they can only look helplessly at flyers, and this can actually block them. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it is Blight Pile, which for 1 generic and a black is a 3/3 uncommon creature, Phyrexian. It's got Defender, and for 2 generic and a black, you can tap it, and each opponent loses X life, where X is a number of creatures with Defender you control. This is a very real win condition for the Defender deck, which looks like a real deck in the format, and even outside of that deck, a 2 mana 3/3 with Defender is actually a solid thing to have around if you're a control deck. It shuts down a lot of early attackers. It can always make your opponent lose 1 life with its ability too, even outside of a deck with other defenders. Like the other defender payoffs in the format, I think I do have to give this 2 grades. It's probably only a C- in a regular black deck in the format, but I think it's a B- in a deck that has a lot of defenders. Next up, it's Bone Splinters, which for 1 black mana is a common sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature, destroy target creature. We've seen this card many times, and it's always fine. Obviously, 1 mana to kill something is really nice, but the requirement to sacrifice a creature is enough to keep it from being anywhere close to premium. Obviously, there are black decks in the format that are going to be able to make really good use of this, especially black-white and black-red, both of which like it when things die. It's pretty dangerous to run more than 1 copy of this, since it's situational, but I think the first copy is probably a C+ for those sacrifice and graveyard decks. That does mean it is sort of a build-around, but I think it's going to be like a C in most black decks, so there isn't really a drastic enough difference to give it that build-around grade. If you are playing like a spell-heavy deck that has like 7 creatures, obviously you can't play this at all. Next up, it's Braid's Arisen Nightmare, which for 1 generic and 2 black is a 3/3 legendary nightmare at rare. At the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice an artifact, creature, enchantment, land, or planeswalker. If you do, each opponent may sacrifice a permanent that shares a card type with it. For each opponent who doesn't, that player loses 2 life and you draw a card. This new Braids looks sweet. A 3 mana 3/3 is a good starting point, and making your opponent choose between letting you draw and losing life or sacrificing their own permanent is pretty sweet. You won't want to do that every turn, of course, especially if you play this like on turn 3, but luckily it's a may and not a must trigger. There will be lots of times where making your opponent make that choice is hugely powerful. Like if your opponent has missed a land drop and you're doing fine on mana, you can really cause them some pain. And you can also choose card types that they just don't have if you're more interested in drawing cards than lowering your opponent's life. It also fits well into the various black sacrifice things going on in the format. I think this is a B+. Next up, it's Braids' Frightful Return, which for 2 generic and a black is an uncommon enchantment saga. It has read ahead. This is a new saga-specific mechanic that lets you choose which chapter to start a saga on. You obviously don't get the value from the earlier chapters if you start it on the later chapter. So chapter 1 here says you may sacrifice a creature. If you do, each opponent discards a card. Chapter 2 says return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. And chapter 3 says target opponent may sacrifice a non-land, non-token permanent. If they don't, they lose 2 life and you draw a card. So with read ahead on this one, I think you'll pretty frequently start in chapter 2, unless you have a bunch of expendable stuff or you're really worried about what your opponent has in their hand. Giving up a creature, something you have on board, for a card in your opponent's hand isn't normally going to be worth it, even if you get the creature back with chapter 2. Getting a creature back with chapter 2 is pretty nice in general, and the edict or let you draw effect on chapter 3 is also good. And sometimes you'll want to start just on chapter 3, especially if your opponent has like 1 permanent in play, because that situation won't always be around forever. In the late game, chapter 3 does get significantly weaker, but if you manage to get a full card out of chapter 1 and 3, this does end up being a 3 mana 2-for-1, which is pretty strong. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Choking Miasma, which for 1 generic and 2 black is an uncommon sorcery. It has kicker for a green. If it was kicked, you put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, and all creatures get -2/-2 until end of turn. So this is an interesting take on this type of sweeper that black gets in pretty much every format. Normally, this sort of thing is better suited to your sideboard because there aren't enough situations where this will be great. You either end up hurting your own board more than your opponent's, or it just doesn't do enough in any way. However, adding kicker does matter. It helps offset the chances that this hurts you more than your opponent, and really does increase how often casting this will be more beneficial for you than for your opponent. I still don't feel like this is amazing, but I do think you can main deck it and expect it to be a C. Next up, it's the Cruelty of Gix, which for 3 generic and 2 black is an enchantment saga at rare. It has read ahead. Chapter 1 says, target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a creature or planeswalker card from it. That player discards that card. Chapter 2 says, search your library for a card, put that card into your hand and then shuffle. You lose 3 life. And Chapter 3 says, put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. This looks pretty sweet. Chapter 1 gives you some nice disruption, but it is great that you can skip it if when you play this, making your opponent discard doesn't accomplish anything. Chapter 2's tutor effect is pretty nice too, though keep in mind, tutors in Limited are always way less impressive than they are in other formats because the average power level of your cards is a lot lower. And if this were just like 5 mana, search your library for a card, lose 3 life, it wouldn't be good. It would probably be an F, just because you're spending way too much mana and not adding to the board while you do this. But luckily this card does a whole lot more than tutor, because it also has Chapter 1 and 3. And Chapter 3 lets you straight up reanimate something. For mini graveyard, if you made your opponent discard a great card with Chapter 1, this can be particularly awesome. I think you will frequently start this at Chapter 1 just because it can allow you to really set everything up, and you can get a ton of value out of it. If you're having a hard time in the game and you're behind, sometimes you'll just start it on Chapter 3 because you really desperately need to add to the board. And again, I don't know how often you'll actually start this on Chapter 2 unless there's some card you really need that, if you get it, will basically win you the game. It's also kind of annoying that Chapter 2 is not a May effect, so if you're at 3 or less life, you just lose when it triggers. But yeah, each of these effects does give you a card worth the value, so this is potentially a 3-for-1. It is a little clunky and it can be a little slow, but the modality helps make up for all of that, because just doing Chapter 3 when you need to just do Chapter 3 is going to feel good, and grinding out all the value possible out of Chapters 1 through 3 is going to feel really good when you have the time to do that. I'm giving this a B+. Next up, it's Cult Conscript, which for 1 black mana is a 2/1 skeleton warrior at uncommon. It enters the battlefield tapped, and you can pay 1 and a black to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only if a non-token skeleton creature died under your control this turn. This looks pretty good. Notably, it can block. Of course, it can't the turn it comes into play or comes back from the graveyard, because it comes into play tapped, but the ability to block on a 2-power recursive creature definitely matters. Often creatures like this just can't block. Bringing a 2/1 back over and over again is a decent thing to be doing in a game of Limited in general, especially because you can play this on turn 1 and it can do some work. This will be especially nice in any deck that can get extra value out of bringing it back over and over again. And it looks like black decks in this format are going to be particularly good at it. I'm giving this a B-. It seems like this is going to be a really key card for a lot of black decks in the format. Next up, it is Cut Down, which for 1 black is an uncommon instant, and it says destroy target creature with total power and toughness 5 or less. So this is a little weird, but I think it's premium removal. It can kill a whole lot of things that cost more than 1 mana, and sometimes it can really trade up. It can kill most 1, 2, and 3 drops, and a fair bit of cards higher up on the curve too. It can get blanked by a pump spell or something, but that's true of a lot of really cheap removal, even something like Lightning Bolt. The fact this is an instant is great too. I think this is a B. Next up, it's Defier of Flesh, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a 4/4 Phyrexian Horror at rare. It's got Menace, and as an additional cost to cast a black permanent spell, you can pay 2 life. Those spells cost black less to cast if you paid this way. This effect reduces only the amount of black mana you pay, and whenever you cast a black permanent spell, target creature you control gets +1/+1 and gains Menace until end of turn. A 4 mana 4/4 with Menace is a great place to start. That's like a B, and this comes with the same upside as the other Defilers do. It can make your permanents of the same color easier to cast by giving up 2 life for one of those colored mana symbols. Casting black permanents in general is going to be awesome, as you get to give Menace and a stats boost to something, and that will usually mean you're attacking with 2 Menace creatures, which can be hard to deal with all game long. This is a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Drag to the Bottom, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a rare sorcery. It has Domain, and that means you get a bonus effect from this card for each basic land type among lands you control. In this case, each creature gets -X/-X until end of turn, where X is 1 plus the number of basic land types among lands you control. So this has the potential to completely reshape a game in your favor, but it does have a few problems. Like all sweepers, it can be a little bit awkward in Limited, since almost all decks want to have some sort of board presence these days, so you're likely to sweep away some of your own stuff. That is always something to keep in mind with sweepers. This particular sweeper also asks you to get Domain going to unlock its full power, though it is worth noting that you can sort of customize it to some extent, so maybe it wrecks smaller creatures and doesn't hurt your bigger ones. So basically, this asks for setup and board states where you're sure a sweeper will help you more than it helps your opponent. And those aren't always going to manifest themselves. Still, sweepers have an ability to turn the tide of a game in ways that almost nothing else can. I generally don't give most of them bomb grades because of their awkwardness and Limited. To be a bomb, a sweeper usually has to do something like be really efficient at destroying everything like Wrath of God, or do something like save one of your creatures while destroying everything else. And while you can produce those situations, they're not that easy to make happen with this card. It's still pretty darn powerful though. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Eerie Soul Tender, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/1 Spirit Cleric at common. When it enters the battlefield, you mill 3 cards, and you can pay 4 generic and a black to exile it from your graveyard, and when you do, you return another target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So there's a lot of graveyard stuff in this set, especially in black, and this is both a self-mill payoff and enabler, which is pretty nice. That graveyard effect can be good because sometimes if you're doing the self-mill thing, you mill something you didn't really want to lose, and this can provide some insurance on that front. It does have pretty bad stats, but I think the graveyard decks in the format will feel fine about running one of these. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it is Evolved Sleeper, which for 1 black is a 1/1 human at rare. You can pay 1 black to have it become a human cleric with base power and toughness 2/2. You can pay 1 generic and a black, and if it's a cleric, you put a death touch counter on it, and it becomes a Phyrexian human cleric with base power and toughness 3/3. And then you can also pay 1 generic and 2 black, and if it's a Phyrexian, put a +1/+1 counter on it, then you draw a card and you lose 1 life. This is really good. Paying 4 mana for a 3/3 with Death Touch isn't amazing, but you do at least pay it in installments, and once you have it as a 3/3 Death Touch, what really makes it great is that ability to draw you cards and make itself larger. That's going to be an insane mana sink that can very easily win you the game in just a couple of turns, because not only do you draw cards, the sleeper gets larger and larger and becomes more and more of a problem. The one downside the card has is that it is relatively fragile, and if you're pumping mana into it and then your opponent kills it before you really ever get to take advantage of its ability, that's not going to feel great. But I still feel like this is a bomb. If you play it early, it will be a creature that can do some work, and then in the later game is when it really turns into a powerhouse. I'm giving this an A-. Next up, it's Extinguish the Light, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a common instant, and it says destroy target creature or planeswalker. If its mana value was 3 or less, you gain 3 life. A 4 mana instant that can destroy any creature is already about a B- in most formats. It's premium, so adding the upside of life gain is pretty real. It does always stink to spend 4 mana to kill something that your opponent paid less mana for, so the consolation prize here is that you gain 3 life, and that makes a real difference. They did make sure to make it cost double black so you can't splash it, but I still think this is a B. Next up, it is Gibbering Barricade, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/4 Nightmare Wall at common. It's got Defender, and you can pay 2 generic and a black and sack a creature to gain 1 life and draw a card. This slots in nicely in decks that care about Defender, as well as in the graveyard and sacrifice decks in the format. And on top of that, even if you have none of that going on, this is kind of a reasonable card in any black control deck. A 3 mana 2/4 Defender can really lock down the ground for a while, and the ability to cash stuff in is nice. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it is Knight of Dusk's Shadow, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 human knight at uncommon. It has Menace. Your opponents can't gain life, and you can pay 1 generic and a black, and it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Like its white counterpart, this is a very good uncommon. While I do think First Strike is a bit better than Menace, the fact that this can buff its stats is still a pretty big deal, especially because it has Menace, and it makes it difficult to interact with effectively in combat. Basically, this feels amazing on turn 2, is solid in the mid game, and then in the late game when both players are sort of in top deck mode, it can really do a ton of work. Nerfing life gain doesn't hurt either. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it is Liliana of the Veil, which costs 1 generic and 2 black for a legendary planeswalker, Liliana at Mythic Rare. She starts with 3 loyalty. She has a +1 that says each player discards a card, a -2 that says target player sacrifices a creature, and a -6 that says separate all permanents target player controls into 2 piles. That player sacrifices all permanents in the pile of their choice. Liliana of the Veil is one of the strongest planeswalkers in the history of Magic, but in Limited, she's merely really good. The symmetrical discard effect isn't always going to be attractive, and sometimes her -2 won't be that impressive either, because your opponent has multiple bodies they can sacrifice. That said, if you do play her on turn 3 and your opponent has 1 creature and you make them sacrifice it, they will have a pretty hard time winning that game because you'll be ripping apart their hand, you'll be ahead of them on board, and then you'll get to the ultimate. But if you play her when it isn't turn 3 and your opponent has a built-out board with more than one creature, she's useful and nice, but not going to drastically alter the game in your favor. You'll resort in that case to just using her +1 and trying to get to her ultimate, but it's not going to be that easy to do because she doesn't really protect herself in any meaningful way, apart from maybe making it harder for your opponent to go wide because you're getting rid of cards in their hand. Most of the time, if you play her on turn 3, she's going to feel like a bomb. The rest of the time, she'll feel more like a B-. I think that makes her a B overall. Next up, it is Monstrous War Leech, which for 3 generic and a black is an uncommon leech horror. It has kicker for a blue. It's a star. When it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, you mill 4 cards, and its power and toughness are each equal to the highest mana value among cards in your graveyard. So, the ceiling for this card is that it's a really efficient vanilla creature. That's not super impressive to me. The good news is you do have other things in the set that care about things in graveyards, and this does help set those up in addition to taking advantage of that all on its own. But I do think you really need to have some other graveyard payoffs around, or playing this just won't feel like it's worth it most of the time. It also doesn't help that this format has lower than usual mana values, partly as a result of kicker, because they don't have to print as many high mana cards because a lot of the low mana cards can just have kicker and be more expensive, and thus they don't actually have that high of a mana value. So getting Monstrous War Leech to be more than like a 5/5 isn't going to be very easy in most decks. And overall, none of that stuff is that impressive. I think this is just a C. Next up, it's Phyrexian Rager, who for 2 generic and a black is a 2/2 Phyrexian Horror at common. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. Great reprint from the original Invasion block. This is a 2-for-1. It's big enough to trade and it draws you a card. That always plays really well in Limited. This is one of Black's best commons. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it is Phyrexian Vivisector, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 Phyrexian Human at common. When a creature you control dies, you scry 1. This is not the most exciting death payoff ever, but it does have solid stats, and scrying is something. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Phyrexian Warhorse, which for 3 generic and a black is a 3/3 Phyrexian Horse at common. It has kicker for 1 white. When it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, you create a 1/1 white soldier creature token, and you can pay 1 and sack another creature, and it gets +2/+1 until end of turn. I'm not ultra impressed with either mode here. You're either getting a Hill Giant that has a decent ability, or paying 5 mana for a 3/3 and a 1/1, and that 3/3 still has that decent but not great ability. The Warhorse can sacrifice stuff to get bigger, and the threat to do that is legitimate. The threat of activation here can be very real, but I don't feel like this is efficient or powerful enough to be a card that always makes the cut. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Pilfer, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery. It says target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it. That player discards that card. A 2-mana Coercion is a pretty big upgrade from the 3-mana versions of this effect. It gives you decent information and can really disrupt your opponent. You still pay 2 mana for a 1-for-1 that doesn't add to the board at all, but I think 1 copy of this is going to see play in black decks. I'm giving this a C-. Next up, it's the Raven Man, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/1 legendary human wizard at rare. At the beginning of each end step, if a player discarded a card this turn, create a 1/1 blackbird creature token with flying, and this creature can't block, and you pay 3 generic and a black and tap it, and each opponent discards a card. Activate only as a sorcery. The Raven Man is pretty strong. He's a nice discard payoff, and while there isn't a ton of that in this set, there is some, and he luckily comes with the ability to make your opponent discard all on his own. So, if you get to untap with him and you have 4 mana available, and your opponent has at least 1 card in hand, paying 4 and tapping him to get rid of that card and make a 1/1 flyer is very nice, even if the flyer doesn't block. He is definitely kind of clunky. In situations where your opponent doesn't have anything in their hand, it's going to feel a little miserable, but at least he's always a 2-mana 2/1. I'm giving him a B. Next up, it is Sengir Connoisseur, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 3/3 vampire at uncommon. It's got flying, and whenever 1 or more other creatures die, you put a +1/+1 counter on the Connoisseur. This ability triggers only once each turn. Every time we see a 5-mana 3/3 flyer that grows when something happens, they have underperformed. The big problem is the high cost and the fact that it can easily die to 2 or 3 mana removal, which is a real hit to tempo. One nice thing here is that you can play her in the first main phase when you have trades to offer, and then put your opponent in kind of an ugly place, but I still envision this being harder to get going than it looks, just because we've seen it so many times, and it's usually not been very impressive. I'm not saying it's bad, mind you, just not a super high quality uncommon, which I think is a lot of people's instinct when you see a card like this, and it's been my instinct in the past, but I've been wrong like 3 times on similar cards, and this time I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Shadow Prophecy, which for 2 generic and a black is a common instant with Domain. You look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of basic land types among lands you control, put up to 2 of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard, you lose 2 life. So black usually gets a card draw spell like this at common, and it's usually a C- or a C, and I think this is a slightly better than normal version of that kind of spell. Usually, you'll pay 3, draw 2, and lose 2 life. Sometimes it's sorcery speed, and this is an instant, but it also gets a pretty nice upgrade when you get Domain going. Looking at 3 cards with this is going to be very doable, and 4 and 5 aren't impossible, and you get to load your graveyard in addition to getting better card selection the higher your Domain is. You can't have too many spells in your deck that don't impact the board, but I think this has a nice baseline and a pretty nice ceiling. And I'd be interested in the first copy of this in most black decks. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it is Shadowrite Priest, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 human cleric at rare. Other clerics you control get +1/+1, and you can pay 3 generic and 2 black and tap it and sack another cleric. To search your library for a black creature card, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle. This format doesn't have a ton of clerics, but there are 3 at common and 2 at uncommon in white, and that's certainly enough to imagine this having a few friends, especially in most black-white decks. It is really nice that at worst, it's a 2-mana 2/2, so playing it in a deck that even has 2 clerics is a reasonable thing to do. Obviously, if your deck also happens to have a huge black creature in it, being able to cheat it into play is a real thing. There aren't enough clerics in this format for this to be incredible, but I do think it sneaks into the lower B range. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Sheoldred the Apocalypse, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a 4/5 legendary Phyrexian Praetor at Mythic Rare. It has Death Touch, and whenever you draw a card, you gain 2 life. Whenever an opponent draws a card, they lose 2 life. Unsurprisingly, this Phyrexian Praetor is quite strong. A 4-mana 4/5 with Death Touch is already at least a B-, maybe even just a B, so adding in the life loss and life gain effects is amazing. It's nice that it also punishes extra draws from your opponent while rewarding you for yours. I do think Sheoldred falls a bit short of being a straight-up A. Those effects can definitely close out a game in your favor, but they do take a while to do the job. Still, if she isn't killed, she will win the game for you because her effects are so powerful. Basically, every turn cycle you create a gap of 4 life between you and your opponent just by having Sheoldred in play. She is a bomb, just not a straight up A. I'm giving her an A-. Next up, it's Sheoldred's Restoration, which for 3 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery. It has kicker for 2 generic and a white, and it says return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. If this spell was kicked, you gain life equal to that card's mana value. Otherwise, you lose that much life. Exile Sheoldred's Restoration. This is a pretty nice reanimation spell. They usually cost about 5 these days, and spending 1 less mana is a big deal because the problem with 5-mana reanimation spells is often that it's pretty difficult to find something to reanimate that's actually worth paying that 5 mana, and it's not going to be super easy to do that for 4 mana, but it will be easier, even if you do have to lose life. And then obviously when you kick this and you reanimate something, it's going to really help you stabilize, assuming you reanimate something relevant. As we've seen, black has self-mill, black has sacrifice. You're going to be able to set this card up relatively easily. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it is Splatter Goblin, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/1 Phyrexian Goblin at common, and when it dies, target creature an opponent controls gets -1/-1 until end of turn. This is a solid 2-drop. It can attack and block quite effectively on many boards, and it can frequently generate 2-for-1s. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it is Stronghold Arena, which for 1 generic and a black is a rare enchantment. It has kicker for a green and or a white. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life for each time it was kicked. Whenever 1 or more creatures you control deals combat damage to a player, you may reveal the top card of your library and put it into your hand. If you do, you lose life equal to its mana value. This is an interesting combination of like Phyrexian Arena and Bident of Thassa, both of which are very strong cards in Limited. and this seems really strong too. If you have a creature who can crack in, you're just going to end up drawing an extra card. You do have to pay life, but that's usually going to be worth it, and the fact that you can kick this helps soften that blow too. This looks like a pretty good value engine. And you do want to value creatures that are evasive, but I think there's enough of those around, and there's going to be enough situations where you can just attack so effectively. Just attacking with something that would be a trade is something that puts your opponent in a pretty bad place. I think that makes this a pretty amazing value engine, and I think it's in the lower range of being a bomb, giving it an A-. Next up, it's Tattered Apparition, which for 3 generic and a black is a 2/2 shade at common. It's got flying, and you can pay 1 generic and a black to give it +1/+1 until end of turn. This has pretty bad base stats, but the fact you can pump mana into it to pump those stats definitely matters, as this can be a real problem in the later stages of the game. It is pretty mediocre early, and the mana it asks for can add up, especially because it's so inefficient to begin with. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Toxic Abomination, which for 1 generic and a black is a 3/2 Phyrexian zombie at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you lose 2 life. Mostly, I don't think this is worth it. The base stats are good, but these days a vanilla 2 mana 3/2 really isn't that amazing and limited. This would probably be a C if it had no downside. And it does mean, being a 3/2 does mean it can trade up, and that's cool. And it'll be a 2-drop you play maybe in the most aggressive decks around. But I think you cut this significantly more than you play it. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Tribute to Urborg, which for 1 generic and a black is a common instant. You can pay a kicker cost of 1 generic and a blue. Target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn. If this spell was kicked, that creature gets an additional -1/-1 until end of turn for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. This looks like a good common and really good removal to me. The base form of this isn't a great removal spell, but it's a passable one, 2 mana for -2/-2. And then kicking this will often make it into a very, very good removal spell. You do double the amount of mana you pay, but you're going to be able to kill a whole lot of things. Black is a color that likes to mill itself, and blue is a color that likes spells, so especially if you're in a black-blue deck straight up where it's very easy for you to kick this is going to be a great common, but I think even in any black deck where you can just sort of splash blue and you have 5 spells, it's still going to be pretty good. Next up, it's Urborg Repossession, which for 1 black mana is a common sorcery. It has kicker for 1 generic and a green, and it says return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. You gain 2 life. If this spell was kicked, return another target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. So we see a common black card in virtually every set that lets you return 2 creatures from your graveyard to your hand, and this is one of the better versions of this we've seen. The fact it gains you life helps make up for how slow this effect can be, and when you kick this, it's actually a pretty powerful spell. You get back a creature and 1 other permanent that can also be a creature, but it can be any kind of permanent, and you gain 2 life for 3 mana. If this was always a black-green card, it would be pretty good, but the fact you can also just cast it for 1 black in a pinch is nice too. I think the first copy of this is a C+. It is always dangerous to go deeper on a card like this because, first of all, it doesn't impact the board right away, and second of all, it's sort of situational. Your graveyard does have to be ready to go. So, getting 2 of these in your opening hand can be kind of a nightmare. And our last black card is Writhing Necromass, which for 6 generic and a black is a 5/5 zombie giant at common. It costs 1 less to cast for each creature card in your graveyard, and it has Death Touch. Casting this for 5 is doable, and that's going to feel pretty good. Again, lots of ways to put things in your graveyard in black and in other colors too, especially blue. The flip side is that sometimes it will be challenging to get a good deal on this card, but I would imagine most of the time by turn 5, casting this for 5 is a very realistic expectation, and it's a pretty nice thing to play on turn 5. I'm giving this a C+. So those are my thoughts on all the black cards in Dominaria United. I'll be back to talk about all the red cards tomorrow, and we'll keep going with a video every day until we're done. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this review and a whole lot of other Magic content, don't forget to subscribe. If you're looking for the rest of this set review, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.